Chapter 12. A Watery Spill. Pete was dumbfounded to find Jack and Helen Moore with Willie Boot. "It doesn't make sense," he said to Diego. "I'm going to find out what it's all about." Running across the street with Diego after him, he called out, "Hi, Jack. Hi, Helen. How's everything at the Dude Ranch?" The Moore children were surprised to see Pete and asked how Pam and the others were. Then Pete introduced the Moores to Diego. "And this is Willie Boot," Helen said to him. "I know Willie," Diego said without enthusiasm. Pete asked if anything had been learned at the Bishop's Ranch about their stolen sheep, but Jack shook his head. Pete kept watching Willie out of the corner of his eye, but the boy kept a stony look and did not act as if he knew anything about it. "I suppose you're wondering why we were with Willie," Helen said. "We met him in town this morning and asked him if he took our old book on Mexico." "I didn't steal it, honest," Willie spoke up. "I guess we'll have to take his word for it," Jack said. With this, Willie started to move off. But Pete took hold of his shoulder. "Just a minute, Willie. If you expect us to believe that, you'll have to tell us one thing." "What's that?" "Where Mesquite Mike lives." Willie looked to the ground and kicked some of the sandy soil with his foot. He asked why they wanted to know, and Pete countered with, "If you have nothing to hide, why won't you tell us?" "Okay," the boy said. "Mike told me he just moved into a place out of town along the river. It's hidden by the trees." Willie began to walk off, then stopped a moment. "Say, don't you tell Mike I told you. He might whip me." Pete promised. Then, after Willie was gone, he urged the Moores to go with him and have a talk with Mesquite Mike. "Maybe we ought to get a policeman," Helen said, a little fearfully. "All right," the boys agreed. While Jack and Helen went into the local headquarters, Pete and Diego hurried to the truck and told Truchas where they were going. "I'm all for it," the old man said. "Jump in." He drove to the police station and picked up the Moores and a friendly young officer to whom they had told their whole story. Grinning, he said, "You children surely are great detectives. We've been suspicious of Mesquite for more than a year and have been trying to investigate his hideout. If we could only find things we think he stole, we could arrest him, but he keeps changing his hideout all the time." "Did you question him?" Helen asked. "Oh yes, we did," the policeman replied. "Mike insisted he was honest and said he camped under the stars. But we figured he had a hut somewhere." "Well, now you know," Pete said proudly. "Are you going to search it?" The officer grinned. "Sure enough. I'll get a warrant. Wait for me outside." A few minutes later, they were on their way to look for Mesquite's place. Since there were only 2 small wooded sections along the river on the outskirts of Sunrise, they could narrow their search immediately. The first of the woods they inspected was used mainly for a picnic ground. It had rustic tables and benches and several small fireplaces. The only spot where anybody could possibly live was a small treehouse, which Diego spied. "Suppose he could live up there?" the ranch boy asked. "I'll take a look," Pete replied. As the officer smiled at the nimble boy, Pete shinned up to the lowest limb and soon was peering into the treehouse. "Nobody lives here but a noisy magpie," Pete called out as an excited bird settled on a limb above him. But as Pete started to climb down, his eyes settled on some strange marks pressed into the floor of the hut. He looked harder and found more. "Hey, did you find something?" the officer called up. "Yes, somebody wearing spurs has been up here," Pete exclaimed. In a few seconds, the officer was beside the boy. "You're right," he said excitedly. "I'll bet Mesquite used this as a lookout," Pete reasoned. "His place must be nearby. Let's go." After they scrambled down the tree, Pete and the officer led the group to the second wood. It was full of gnarled old trees and was crisscrossed with heavy vines. "No shacks here," Jack groaned. "Willie told us a fib." "Wait," Diego said, his sharp eyes glancing at the base of an ancient cottonwood tree. "That's an awful big hole for an animal to make." More like a human coyote, Pete observed. The officer agreed. I'm going to take a look into this. If it's Mesquite's hideout, we won't need the search warrant, because this is not a home. The policeman lighted a match and peered into the hole. Right you are, he exclaimed. This is an underground hut. Nobody's home. As he crawled inside and lighted a candle stuck into the earthen wall, the others followed. The place was full of boxes and newspapers. On a cot in one corner of the room lay a stack of magazines and a few old books. Helen went over and picked up the top book. My stolen book, she cried out. Willie didn't take it. Mesquite Mike was the one. Helen asked the officer if she might keep the book. Of course you may, he replied, and when Mike gets back, I'll take him in on a charge of petty larceny. Helen had started to thumb through the old book. She wanted to see the sketch of Mystery Mountain. But when she came to the chapter on the doll makers, the girl exclaimed, The sketch has been torn out. Mesquite Mike has gone off to find Mystery Mountain, Jack groaned. Then we ought to go after him, Pete declared. But how? Helen asked. Maybe Mike didn't take the page with him, the officer suggested. Let's look around. A hunt began. The page did not show up, but Pete did find a crumpled sheet on which was drawn a crude map. Maybe this tells how to get to Mystery Mountain, the boy said excitedly. The officer looked at it, saying he doubted that the drawing was any good. Nevertheless, Pete put the paper into his pocket. After they got back to town and the officer had left them, Jack and Helen said that they were going to start off the next morning to hunt for Mystery Mountain. They proposed making a party of it. How about Pete, Pam, and Diego joining them? I'd sure like to, Pete answered, and I know Pam would. How about you, Diego? Sorry, the ranch boy replied. Tomorrow's my day to ride Vince. Pete promised to let the Moores know if his parents would consent. Should the Vegas telephone not be working, he would ride over and tell them. What time will you start? He asked. 9 o'clock. Okay, Pam and I'll be there by then. Will you bring lunch, Pete? Helen asked. We'll pack one. Pete said he would. Then the Moores waved goodbye. I wish you were going tomorrow, Diego, Pete said, as Truth just drove off. I'm afraid I can't get out of my job, the boy answered. As the three drove up to the ranch building sometime later, they noticed Ricky ambling toward the dogie, who was now staked to a rope in the field. What's he up to? Pete wondered. His brother went to the animal and gently patted his head. Then he quickly untied the dogie and sprang onto the animal's back. The calf was so surprised that at first he did not move. Get up, Ricky commanded. Suddenly the calf leaped forward. The boy clung to his neck so he would stay on. Away the calf went around the barnyard, running and bucking and trying to throw his rider to the ground. But Ricky dug his knees in and hung on. Suddenly the dogie stopped short, as if he had been struck by a bright idea. Then he set off again at a furious gait and headed directly towards a trough filled with water for the farm animals. All at once, the calf stiffened his forelegs and skidded to a sudden halt. Ricky went flying over his head into the water. Pete sprang forward to help his brother, but this was not necessary. Ricky rose, dripping wet and spluttering water from his mouth and nose. I know a good name for the dogie, Pete suggested. What, Bronco? Diego asked, grinning. No, let's call him Dunker. Ricky sure was dunked in the water. As the dripping boy walked toward the ranch house to change his clothes, Diego went off to capture the calf. Meanwhile, Truchas had put the truck away and now came over to where the children were standing. Holly and Sue had joined them. Don't you think we ought to do the secret now? Sue asked the old herder. The man took off his sombrero and scratched his head, as if this would help him decide what to answer. Finally, he said, You got a point there, senorita. I was going to wait till the Jeep came back, but I guess we can use the truck. Sue jumped up and down, clapping her hands excitedly. Holly pulled Truchas' head down near her mouth and whispered something to him. He grinned and said aloud, "I guess we can't keep this a secret any longer. Well, who wants to tell it?" Each of the little girls wanted to, but felt that it would not be fair until Ricky got back. They did not have long to wait because their brother had changed his clothes in very few minutes. As he ran up to the group, Sue said, "We're allowed to tell a secret now. I want to be the one." "All right, go ahead," Ricky agreed, and Holly nodded.